Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking about ethical questions from the new movie Spider-Man No Way Home. And we're doing that with Nathan Blackwell and Krissy Lenz of the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast. There'll be a little bit of, 80s nostalgia there thrown in, along with me talking a lot about how much I miss New York City. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. And as I said, I've got two great guests with me today. You all have heard me talk about what I'm doing on the Marvel Movie Minute podcast, where I'm going to talk about Thor in great depth. One of the most fun things we're doing on that podcast is that every bunch of 5 episodes every week, we're bringing on different guests, and it's giving me a chance to learn about and work with all sorts of great people who are doing fun podcasts. And frankly, when I heard about there was a podcast dedicated to the greatest decade in human history and my favorite for movies, having nothing to do with the fact that it's the decade I grew up in, the 80s, I knew I had to get you folks on. So Nathan, Krissy, so glad to have you on.
Thanks so much.
Super excited. It's going to be tons of fun. Can't wait to talk about Spider-Man.
Awesome. Well, let me start with, what did you kind of know about Spider-Man going into this movie? And I'm curious both in terms of like what you've seen of the MCU stuff, but also like, granted, not movie, but the Spider-Man cartoon was obviously a big part of childhood in the 80s and 90s. The comic books. Where was Spider-Man for each of you and kind of your personal mythology of heroes and stuff?
You want to go first, Nathan?
Sure. So I grew up on Spider-Man. Like, Spider-Man was my dude. I think we all have kind of like entry or gateway superheroes that kind of like get you into the genre or superheroes in general. And while like Superman and Batman were definitely a part of that, Spider-Man was really the one that I gravitated towards when I could, when I was old enough to make decisions, and to have judgments. Because, I mean, everyone starts off thinking Superman's cool, but then I eventually went the Spider-Man path. But yeah, just him being human and him being relatable. And, and it was interesting. Like, my brother, my younger brother by 2 years, Logan, he was more into getting the comic books, and I would read them. But I was more into, rather than reading the individual issues, more the culture and the world building. And like, I would get those books from the library about like, like the all the different villains and all the different locations of Spider-Man, and I'd watch the cartoons. But I Spider-Man is very fundamental to my kind of like entry into superheroes.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on the relatable part. In talking about Thor so much, we talk about how like, yes, Thor is a story about fathers and sons, about sibling rivalry, and those are things I can identify with. But I'm not a Norse god. I don't have those experiences. Whereas, for Peter Parker, where, I've never slung around in buildings, but, dealing with a high school bully and trying to figure out how to ask a girl out without, your head exploding, these are things I can relate to. I think you're totally right with Spider-Man being that relatable character. What about for you, Krissy?
I was never like a comic book kid, and so I definitely like took in the cartoons, like the animated series that would be offered to me on an after school basis. But I never really I was a lot into X-Men and the Batman Beyond and sort of those cartoons or animated series. They're way too serious to be cartoons, as we all know. And I just only knew of Spider-Man as, a pop culture situation. It wasn't until, of course, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Mans came out and was very into those. And then my daughter, who is 15, has always gone to Spider-Man. Spider-Man is kind of one of her top heroes. And so we used to watch Ultimate Spider-Man and all of that together. She's, really into the Andrew Garfield Spider-Mans that came out when she was like right at the perfect age. So that's more my experience than like my own childhood.
That makes sense. And I am a Garfield fan. I know that's a somewhat unique thing, but I applaud her good taste then for that.
Yeah, he's her Spider-Man, and she stands by it and she defends it.
Well, more power to her.
Yeah.
I can't help but be a Tobey Maguire. I'm in terms of just the first cinematic version that you kind of latched onto, but I totally love the Tom Holland version and everything
so
that the director John Watts and then the two writers have done with all three films. Like they're definitely the top. They've just taken the ball and run with it and done amazing work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love the Tobey Maguire ones. Like, fell in love with them absolutely, and still really enjoy them and find them highly rewatchable, of course. But there's just something about the Tom Holland Spider-Man that is so pure. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I can get that. And Tobey Maguire were definitely the ones that I fell in love with first. In preparation for this new movie, I went back and rewatched them, and I have to say the did not age well factor, for me at least, was very high. Especially like in this new movie, and also in the last two, seeing Zendaya as this like, nuanced, well-developed, quirky, interesting character of MJ compared to Kristen Dunst, who I think the actress did the best thing she could with the material, but basically she just looked pretty and was an object for him and Harry to have desire for. Like, it's just night and day. But yeah, I can see how for all these different versions, you fall in love with the one you meet first. And before we get into the movie itself, I wanted to ask one more question there, because especially here on the FX podcast, we're often talking about what does it mean to be a hero and like different ideas of, are you about justice? Are you about vengeance? What is your goal? When you think of Spider-Man as a hero, what do you kind of think of as like the core for him in terms of like what is right, what is wrong, what he's willing to do, and what lines he won't cross?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the baseline is like what is the right thing for superheroes in general to do, and you look more in terms of like the most superheroes, it's okay to beat the living crap out of them, and then in their movie version to kill them. Usually they decide to take a bit of a high ground, and then the villain accidentally dies, or they're the architects of their own death. But I feel like Spider-Man has always been, I think, a product because of his age, but also because it's just been an important part of his, neighborhood Spider-Man, relatable, wearing his heart on his sleeve, that it's always been about that struggle of doing the right thing, despite the universe plotting against him. It seems like everything is always thrown at Peter Parker. He can never have what he wants. But he still tries to be the guy who does the right thing, I feel like you see that when he is thrown into a group of other heroes, like in the Avengers, that he still has much more of that purity than the heroes around him.
Yeah, fully agree with that. I always love that Spider-Man is one of the like handful of heroes who still maintain a sense of humor and like joy at, a joie de vivre, if you will. They're still kind of excited about life in general. And, that's part of Peter Parker being so young. And having that feeling of newness about everything, whereas like you compare it to a Steve Rogers who's just like so serious all the time and is like, no, always we are this way, and
and Ant-Man really is the adult, Spider-Man.
Yes, so true.
I agree with that.
But Spidey is so much guided by parental figures, like he has Uncle Ben, he has Aunt May, he has Tony in these versions. Like he's so young and open-minded that it's easy for him to be guided by the people in his life who encourage him to do good.
Yeah. I think that's such a good way of putting it, especially in terms of like the purity you're talking about and the youth, because I think he has that kind of quality that at times you can see as optimism and idealism, and at other times you can see as naivete, and like it's always walking that line, and it's such a, in the same way that so many of the other heroes are, you can say that they walk a line between like realistic versus jaded and cynical, you know? And like one thing that always struck me is that I think actually a great version of the Spider-Man story, and more we're seeing video games as canon, or at least as valuable stories. The Spider-Man video game that came out a couple of years ago, like one thing I noticed early on is in the game you're constantly knocking people off the tops of tall buildings that you're fighting on. And I was thinking like, oh, well, he's killing a lot of people. That's not but sure, that's the video game. Until I kind of, a friend pointed this out, that if you, after the fight, like swing around and look at the building, you see that every single one of them is webbed up to the side of the building. Like the game makes a point to show that like he will, in every situation, he'll always try to save the life.
Yeah.
And it's something I think that is such an interesting part of his character. And some of my favorite dynamics are ones in which that kind of optimism comes into conflict with the jadedness. Are you both Daredevil fans? Have you seen the season 2 of Daredevil on Netflix?
Yeah, I haven't read the comics, but I've seen the Netflix shows.
I've seen season 1.
Okay.
So no spoilers.
No, please.
I won't spoil anything.
Spoil away.
In season 2, and this is something I talk about all the time because I think it's such an ethically rich moment, there's this fantastic scene between Daredevil and Punisher. Right. And Daredevil is saying, like, you know, he wants to rehabilitate. Punisher is saying he wants to kill them, you know. And my understanding is, and Nathan, you might know more about this than I do, is that scene works for Daredevil and Punisher, but in the comics, that kind of debate was often happening between Spider-Man and Punisher. You know, with Spidey being like, well, but you don't have to kill them, and Frank Castle being like, no, we should, you know, you hit them, they get back up. I hit them, they get back down.
Yeah, I feel there's definitely a line in terms of like, what are the I don't kill people superhero side, and I feel like Daredevil and Spider-Man were both on that side. You know, they would always kind of butt heads in terms of other things. It's interesting, like Spider-Man and Daredevil, I feel like are always kind of tied together. You know, I feel they're both street level heroes. Like, it's not that I've got New York, I've got like Queens. You know,
I've got Queens. You've got like, Hell's Kitchen.
Hell's Kitchen, which is pretty small area. It's like, oh, well, I can't leave the boundaries. It's over there. Oh yeah, Luke Cage has got that over there. But
and in fairness, as a New York City resident, Hell's Kitchen doesn't really exist anymore. It's mostly Disneyland North. But
right.
It's a great idea.
I've got Disneyland North.
I would be like, North I would defend Disneyland.
Right.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah, and I feel like I would say you could probably find a bunch of Daredevil Punisher moments that were similar, but
oh sure,
but yeah, because I remember there was a lot of debate over the Ben Affleck version, to where in the beginning of the scene, the beginning of the first scene, like he kills some dudes like straight up, and people were upset at that the arc of the movie was that he then learns I shall not kill.
Yeah.
You know, rather than starting at that. The problem is that then you've got like 98% of the movie where he's kind of going against the grain of what the character stands for, you know?
Right. And I think especially in the Netflix version, we can have conversations about someone who says, I won't kill people, I will just hit them in the head with an iron pipe. You know, because that certainly can't cause death.
I will concuss all of the bad guys.
I shall concuss you.
And I think there's something really interesting there as well, because, and again, I don't want to put words in Spider-Man's mouth, but as I understand it, I can see Daredevil and Spider-Man having such an interesting comparison there, because for Daredevil, sometimes he thinks people deserve to die. It's that he thinks it's not, he doesn't have the right to kill them. Where Spider-Man, I think, is even more on the idealistic side of like, they shouldn't die, they don't deserve to die, you know? And that is, as we see so much this movie is about, is he wants to save everybody, even the villain.
Yeah, he's a hero of the heart. Daredevil is a hero of the law. Yeah. It's the institutions that they ultimately believe in. Like, Spider-Man sees himself as a protector, as someone who is there for the common person who, when they're worried about someone over their shoulder, that he's there to help them, you know?
Definitely. Well, and so with all that going into it, what'd you think of this movie?
Oh, it's so good.
So I loved it so much. And it was, I mean, I wasn't as excited going into it as I probably should have been. I was definitely not as excited going in as I was coming out, because I, just sort of felt like, well, I know what they're going to do. I know what they're going to do. And I completely underestimated the impact that it would have.
Yeah. So, okay, so are we now officially going into full 100 unabated spoilers?
Yeah, this is now a generally with this show, if you're listening, we assume that you've watched the thing we're talking about. But yeah, at this point, if you have not yet seen Spider-Man No Way Home, hit the pause button.
Go see it twice.
Find a way to watch it. If you're waiting for it to be out online, which I very much sympathize with, and I'm gonna do another episode later about the streaming the companies that won't release these things on streaming, because that's a whole ethical question. But whether it's 45 days from now or just tomorrow, hit pause if you haven't seen it yet.
Away with you!
Let's jump on in.
Yes, and if you haven't seen it, then you're a fool! A fool! Very well, then you deserve this.
Spoil away. What do you got?
Oh, that's all I want.
I
have nothing else to say. Good night, everyone.
I gotta say, like, the moment when Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, Peter Parker, comes through. So they Ned opens the portal, and you see a Spider-Man, right? And we kind of know it's probably not our Spider-Man, but my daughter, who's sitting next to me, she like grabs me and she's like, "That's him, that's him, that's him, that's him, that's Garfield, that's Garfield." And I was like, "What?" And she's like, "I can tell by the shape of his head."
You gotta love a true fan.
Yeah.
I mean, there you go.
So when he like jumped in and like took the mask off, like, just her delight was so
the gasps
awesome.
in the audience.
Mm-hmm.
For those who weren't prepared for it.
Yeah.
For me, that is such a beautiful moment, because one thing we talk about on the show a lot is not just the ethics of the stories that we as fans love, but also the ethics of fandom itself, and I think I am all for being critical of things. I'm all for like talking about, performances that we don't think are good. I think one of the worst parts of fandom can be when it crosses over from I don't like the Andrew Garfield version of Spider-Man into I'm going to harass Andrew Garfield on social media, or I'm going to talk about how terrible he is. And as a Star Wars fan, certainly this is something we have a lot to account for. And I mean, I remember I hadn't seen the Andrew Garfield movies until very recently, because at the time my thought was we just had Tobey Maguire. I don't want a new one. And knowing how negative a lot of the fan base had been for and that some of it had crossed into those lines of harassing him, and like he's talked about, that was a really hard thing for him to go through. The cheer that I heard in the audience when he took off the mask and you saw it was him, and everything about him all the way through to trying not to get choked up, him having that wonderful moment where he gets to save MJ the way he couldn't save Gwen. It was just, it's beautiful for the movie, but it felt to me like it was also in some way we didn't treat Garfield right as fans. This movie is going to address that, and I love it.
Yeah, so if you're a jerk and you haven't seen the movie and you're still listening, they really do make all the right moves. Like, if you are attached to any of the Spider-Man movies, like, they really do touch and pay off for everyone, and they do such a great job of doing justice to every damn character that ever appears on screen. Like, from J. Jonah Jameson, who has 180 seconds of screen time, to all the different Spider-Mans, all the different villains, all the characters we've come to know from the Homecoming kind of trilogy. Like, they do fantastic. Yeah.
And I think too, part of the Andrew Garfield, the thing that I think caught my kids' fancy in that version is something that you mentioned, Matthew, is that the Gwen Stacy character is as smart as Peter, and is as brave, and bold, and she really is somebody to look up to and admire. And so I think that difference in that character made the Andrew Garfield version more accessible and meaningful to kids who didn't get who got Andrew Garfield first in their let's go to the movies, and not didn't experience Tobey Maguire till later.
Yeah. My spouse, who watched all of them with me, commented that if you look at the Kirsten Dunst character and then the Emma Stone and then now Zendaya, you basically get 25 years of history of how Hollywood treats leading women in superhero movies, because, and again, I think Kirsten Dunst is a great actress. But her part is just to be a damsel in distress. And then Gwen Stacy gets to be a lot smarter and a lot more of like challenging Garfield all the way up to Zendaya, and her version of the character. And it's just, I hadn't even thought of that, but it's great to hear that, that's a part of why characters like the Garfield more is because who he's playing against. Yeah. It's a better relationship there. So let's talk about some of the other kind of specific questions we get into with the movie itself. And let's start with the villains, because I think, again, one of the things I think the movie did so well was to bring in all of these villains. And instead of making them just from day one, they want to just break stuff and be terrible and they have to be stopped, each of them is presented as complex characters who are now facing their own decisions about what do I want to do? I'm in this situation. And especially with Osborn and with Osborn and with Otto and even Electro, with all of them, we get these great choices. What do you think about how the villains were portrayed, especially in terms of like where they stand as like ethical or not ethical, or the unredeemable villain versus the sympathetic and etc.
Well, I feel like this movie, from a superhero standpoint, breaks new ground, because it's almost expected that the hero is going to kill off the villain. No, I tried to save you, but you had to go for the bomb. Why did you go for the bomb and blow yourself up? The hubris. And then he dies, and it's like, oh man. And I remember being so glad that they didn't kill off Michael Keaton in the Homecoming one. It's like, that's, what a relief, just, it just became so expected that you had to kill them off. But I can't think of, other than like, maybe like the Thor and Loki relationships of having, so it's not until they've already rounded up pretty much all the villains that Peter makes this decision. He makes the decision that I don't want to send them to their death. If it is now my choice. I know what is going to happen. Doctor Strange, my kind of new father figure of this movie, is telling me it is their fate. It must happen. And he says, I can't do this. And so the hero makes now a conscious choice to try to fix the villain's problems. Many of, you've got the Sandman, you've got Shocker, who have these like scientific accidents. You've got Doc Ock as well. All these villains, they've had accidents happen to them.
Or they've done it to themselves. Like that was a hilarious moment. Yeah. You got to be careful where you fall. So genius. But and then you've got the three scientists who did what they did to themselves through their scientific hubris, right? They're hoisted on their own petard, literally, and in its tentacle-like form.
They're the consequence of whatever kind of pursuit that they had for power or achievement. So Peter Parker makes the decision, no, I want to help them. I want to see if I can fix them. And I will have them participate in this process. We
get that a little bit from Aunt May when Norman Osborn sort of comes into her shelter, of her saying, we're going to help people. This is what we do. He needs help. And he's asking for help. And so we're going to help.
Yeah, and then I think that really can translate to the "it's what we do" line that keeps coming up, and I mean, I'm going to keep coming back to that moment. It's one of my favorites. It's part of why I think the Garfield MJ moment is so important, because, he tried to save Gwen Stacy, who was, the person he himself was completely in love with. Now, when it's MJ falling, like, he has empathy in that, this is the person who's in love with his kind of mirror version, but he doesn't know her. He knows almost nothing about her. And yet he's just as quick to be like, I'm going to save this person. And I think part of the implication is, even if she wasn't, the other Peter Parker's girlfriend, she was just random woman number 6 who was in danger, helping people, saving people is absolutely what Spider-Man does.
Yeah, but I think this is the first time we really get to see, like, no, I'm going to help them. Like, I'm going to undo the thing that made them bad, right? Because they're not inherently evil. They all, or the Thomas Hayden Church character was a criminal.
Right.
The other 3 were like doctor scientists. So they...
I mean, Osborn pretty much killed one of his associates in order to help even before he became the Green Goblin. Like, he was evil capitalist number 16.
Okay,
Right. But yeah, he becomes much worse, to be sure.
Yeah, so it's like we're gonna take away the thing that's making them or encouraging this bad behavior, right? The serum of the Green Goblin, the chip for Dr. Octopus, kind of undo or to, take away their magical abilities so that then they're just regular human dum-dums again. We all know regular human dum-dums aren't evil and never do anything wrong.
Of course not. Well, and that's actually that for me was one of the biggest ethical questions that I wanted to talk about, and I'm probably going to do a whole episode on just these 2 questions, so we don't have to go into too much depth. But I'm curious if you're all where I am. I had a lot of problems with what Spider-Man did here, and to me this is kind of where that question of idealism crossing into naivete kind of starts to come out. First, just because, and again, this is kind of how the movie was set up. You have a long period of time where the villains are loose, and Spider-Man is saying, I won't push this button that will put them all back because I think I want to save them, and so I'm willing to have them be out in the wild while I try to round them all up. I mean, I'm talking about them as though they're zoo animals, but you know what I mean? Like, and the movie makes it very easy for him because apparently Green Goblin, Doc Ock, all the rest of them are out in the world for 7-8 hours and do absolutely no harm to anybody, which is interesting. But I look at that, and one of my questions is, if, Green Goblin went out and killed 10 people, or Doc Ock did his thing, or whatever, would Peter be responsible for that? In terms of, like, because he made this decision, I want to save people, even though it means I'm not stopping the danger right now. Where do you think that falls? Is that a time where Spidey's idealism is going too far, or is that risk worthwhile to save these people?
Well, I would say that I don't feel like he, in terms of like culpability, I don't feel like he was. I mean, he didn't have like a fire lit under him, but I don't feel like enough time passed in terms of seeking out these villains and hunting them down. That I would have given him culpability for it, personally. In terms of, Krissy, I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, kind of agree. Like, if they each kill one person, then the lives that he saved aren't, or if they go back to their home worlds and kill people. But I think that in this universe, Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and the heroes who went through the whole blip situation had to answer that question of, like, what is one life worth if the impact of removing half of the life on planet Earth means that the Earth is better. But then you take it to, like, each individual person losing somebody. And the people who disappeared, I think them having gone through that, and maybe the fact that both of them got blipped, sort of gave a little bit of like a, well, if we can save a life, we should save a life.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like, especially when all the Spider-Mans got together and it was a Spidey fest, they were both like, but we can save them. We can.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, certainly, like, whether or not you agree with the decision, him deciding to do that felt like very, very much in his character. Like, I've seen some folks who disagree with it, but I've also seen some folks who write things like, why would Spider-Man do that? Doesn't he know he's putting these other lives at risk? And like, no, I don't. To me, that's always, he will always try to save everybody. It's kind of actually, as I think about it, I remember this was actually a part of the first Tobey Maguire movie where, Green Goblin says, along comes a villain to make you make a terrible choice. Do you save the woman you love, or do you save the busload of children? And Peter refuses to choose. He tries to save both, and he does. And it's a Spider-Man movie, so he's successful. But it's interesting that he's never really had to face that question in a real way.
Yeah, I feel like in terms of Spider-Man's decision and the culpability, it really only begins once he makes the choice to try to save them and to have them participate and to trust that to let them out of the cage and to trust to have them participate in it. Because then you basically have, a bunch of roommates and one of them could leave and then start killing people.
One of them stayed in the van. They're like, oh, where's the giant dinosaur? He wanted to stay there. We didn't leave him there.
Yeah. He wanted at that point, when you let the prisoners out of the cage, at that point you are now responsible for their behavior. And if they get out,
that's great responsibility, right? Isn't that great responsibility? Like, now I'm responsible for me and you and you and you and everything that you go forward from here and do. And I think that's sort of his way of like taking on that responsibility and being willing to trust and
and so and from that risk and taking on that responsibility, one person does die.
Yeah. Well, and so they talk about math a lot in this movie. Like, math is like the real hero of this movie. From Doctor Strange's statement that in the grand calculus of the universe, their deaths are more meaningful than their lives. I'm getting that wrong, but it.
I think that's the gist of what he says. Yeah.
And then, to Spider-Man, the math of not, let's save one life. One life is worth saving.
Right. It's almost kind of like it reminds me of some of the debates that like Captain Picard would have with various time travelers. It's like, no, you don't understand is that I live in my time. And if I can make decisions, I don't care about your grand timeline. Like, if it is up to me to save these people and then I will do that. I don't care if they're destined to do blah, blah, blah. I am a citizen of now. Right.
Which is so interesting because a similar question is faced in the original Star Trek series, where I forget the name. I think it's City on the Edge of Forever. It's one of the best Star Trek episodes. I think a lot of people's favorites, where McCoy goes back in time. He saves the life of a woman, and it turns out that the woman was going to be the leader of a great pacifist movement, and that if she lived, America would be so much deeper into pacifism that they wouldn't be able to rearm in time, they wouldn't fight Nazi Germany, and the Nazis would win. And at the end of the episode, the characters decide to let her die. And I think, kind of, Nathan, what you're saying is like Spider-Man, and maybe even Picard, but definitely Spider-Man would go to that and be like, look, I can't talk to you about what's going to happen 10 years down the road. Here's a woman, she's about to be hit by a car. I'm going to save her every time.
Yeah, because that is working under the assumption, too, that time is immovable. And if you're literally traveling in time, guess it's not. I mean, just because this is one possible... how many outcomes does Doctor Strange look at? 14 million or something like that before he finds one where the Avengers win? So keep looking until you find the one. If he had stopped at 13 million, it was just like, oopsie doopsie, guys. Looks like we're not going to win this one. You keep going until you find a way.
And one thing I think is really interesting is kind of pulling it back to the villains a bit. I really like that they're not all the same in terms of, at least the way I saw it, the degree to which they have agency versus there being this outside thing controlling them it's kind of a wide range, in terms of like Doc Ock, it's pretty clear like there are actual different intelligences, sentiences in these arms, and they're controlling his brain. Electro is a guy who's been marginalized and oppressed and bullied and spat on all of his life, and suddenly has the power to fight back. He's not brainwashed. He's got power, and he does some not great things with it. And then all the others are in between. I think to me, it was really interesting seeing how Parker wants to fix all of them, but from their perspectives, like, there's a wide range of how, I don't know, maybe fixable each one of them really is.
And I think that Electro, Jamie Foxx as Electro speaks that quite a bit, where he's like, I like the way I am. I like having power. Right. I want to stay here, but I'd also rather not die. And since you've got the power to kill me, I guess you're calling the shots. Like he's
it's
pretty
definitely
open.
It's definitely a great way to bring up that idea. In some ways, he is an addict to power. He is kind of, but he is also thinking very clearly, which many of these heroes are not. And so he effectively, in that situation, makes a bargain. It's like the Sandman, in a lot of ways, is a criminal who just wants his daughter back. He feels like he doesn't deserve his fate, and his superpower is in a way that he can fight back and resist the forces that he feel are against him.
Right.
So if given the option, I'm sure he would choose to keep his powers. Yeah. And then have his daughter.
And to me, that raises in in some ways I kind of think about, like, of all of them, like, he's kind of going back to the worst situation.
Right, that's what I was, like, he should have been like, is it cool if I stay, like, where I'm not a fugitive from justice? And the same with Electro, like, if he goes home, does he now answer for his crimes in that universe?
Well, and that's my other question, is because, and again, I've commented that I think one of the great things about this movie is that I could love it so much, even though I fundamentally disagree with the main character. And I think I might be, unique in that. I think a lot of people can totally understand where he's coming from, and it's fine if you all disagree as well. But I'm curious, because one of the things is, to me, there's kind of something of a mental illness metaphor going on here, in terms of, the whole idea of, like, can criminal behavior be rehabilitated? Is it traced to mental illness or not? Can it be rehabilitated or just punished? And, like, questions of addiction or all sorts of things like this. And I'm speaking in very general terms here, because I think these are obviously much more complex, nuanced issues. But in that framework, or even without that framework, I think I was somewhat troubled that Peter Parker, he's fixing these people without their consent, even when they're actively fighting against it. And, like, with Doc Ock, there we know that it's the other personality is happening. But, like, with some of the others, I'm kind of curious if you had any thoughts on that, of, like, it makes sense. This is exactly what Peter wants to do. He thinks they can be fixed. But is there any questions to be raised there about, like, should he be trying to fix people when it's not what they would necessarily want?
Yeah, it kind of offers the debate of, if you have someone who is suffering from paranoid delusions and refuses to take medication because they think that that's going to control them, but the medication will most likely make them no longer paranoid, is it ethical to force the medicine upon them and put them in a state where they will most likely be grateful that has happened? Or do you respect their wishes, which is, I do not want any medication, Right. Because I've known people, who have had, like, schizophrenia, who absolutely refuse to be medicated, despite the fact that maybe it would probably help them,
Well, I think that's where kind of the question really goes, because I have it's not like different examples are always there are going to be things on every side. One of my first jobs was working at a disability rights law firm, and one of our client groups was clients who weren't in that position. It was people who were dealing with severe mental illness. Their family was suing them to go on medication. They had been on medication and they hated it. And they thought, it was kind of turning them into zombies or whatever it was. And again, this was 20 years ago. Medications changed so much. But yeah, I think there's such a rich question there of like who gets to decide what is better, who, all these kind of things. And that's a whole other medical debate that I don't know if any of us have the medical degrees to get into. But I love that to me feels like the questions this movie was raising in really interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like the villains were given the opportunity to voice their concerns and to bring it up and to not make it so straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's definitely a tough one because as Nathan was saying, like, can you make that decision if you're not in a place of understanding, and it like for Norman Osborn, and like, I think Doc Ock is the clearest example where it's like he wasn't making his choices from a place of understanding and seeing the true picture. He's seeing the picture he believes is the true picture, and then you've got Electro, who's like, I don't want to give you my power, but I guess if it's that or death, like, I want to keep living. So, the more practical of you, what's the word MJ uses? Pragmatic. He's being very pragmatic. Yeah. But yeah, that's a tough call. And I think Peter was thinking of it, perhaps from the point of view of like, well, I either fix you or you die. So I can't I can't send you back to your universe and you don't die. And I can't send you back without trying to help, knowing that these options are available to me. So, and I think that's a big piece of it too, is like the options were available. Like he felt like
there was really only two paths that he could have taken,
and he had the know-how to fix it, and especially once we got the other Spider-Mans in there, like, Andrew Garfield had the knowledge to fix Dr. Connors because he had been mulling it over, or had already done it once, and Tobey Maguire had been thinking like, how could I have helped Norman?
They were basically dealing with their guilt of how the situation had gone the other way. I
didn't help them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wish I could have.
And that is something I also really loved because I think so often the tone of superhero movies becomes, and granted we like the big fight scenes, that's what looks good on the big screen, but it's, one person says it should be this way, the other person says it should be that way, they start punching each other. Instead of like, well, like I think the greatest movie would be if Tony Stark says we should have some accountability, and Cap says, yes, we should have accountability, but Sokovia is a bad way to do that. And Tony says, okay, good point. Let's talk about a better way to do that. And then Civil War, the boardroom meeting. That's not the meeting everyone wants to movie on.
Civil War PowerPoint.
The meaningful and well-mediated discussion that will have us clashing.
Give us the slide deck they show. And let's talk about Norman for a second, because I think in some ways Norman is much interesting because, and you all might better remember this, but the way I read Norman is, it wasn't even that he had a kind of like outside influence. It was sort of he had a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing going on. Because in the movie, at least we see, and I think from the comics, before he becomes the Green Goblin, Norman's not a great guy. He's kind of a terrible father to Harry. He's terrible to his employees. He's willing to cut. And then what kind of happens is Green Goblin becomes all of the worst parts of that and leaves for Norman all the sort of best parts. And so yeah, he becomes a really interesting thing because it's not anything outside. It's just his personality, but now split into such extremes.
Yeah. So it was definitely kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. They had in the original one, they had almost kind of like a Gollum scene where he is talking to his evil version in the mirror. So yeah, that was really interesting, and I was really, just from a fan point of view, really happy that that in a lot of ways the Green Goblin became kind of the alpha villain when all the other villains are assembled. He just felt so, powerful in terms of a concept, but in terms of the extreme of his personality, that the evil. The evil Green Goblin version was just so sinister, was just so and physically formidable, because he was basically, what they were trying to do is basically create a super soldier serum,
Right.
And how did that go awry? Well, it created this mental instability.
Well, and Willem Dafoe is just such a dynamic performer that, I mean, wow. In his hands, that's really quite something to see. So
I love Molina. I like Jamie Foxx and things. Willem Dafoe just was running circles around every other actor.
He's incredible. And so he sort of presents the other side of the argument to the villains at large when he says, like, these aren't curses, they're gifts. Like, we have been gifted this power. It's exactly what Aunt May says.
He's the villain spokesman.
Yeah, Aunt May says, you have a gift, and that gift is power. Yeah. And with that power comes responsibility. And Norman is saying, we have a gift, we have this power, and with that becomes a obligation to take what we want.
Yeah, we are gods.
And gods don't ask permission.
I hadn't even caught that reference between like what he's saying versus what Aunt May says, but yeah, you're so right.
And he even taunts Peter when they're fighting and says, like, you could have everything that you want, but you're afraid to take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting because, like, ultimately, just as a fan of superhero culture, it's so interesting. It was always fascinating to me. Like, what does this rogues gallery for this hero say about our hero? You've got like all the Batman villains being effectively kind of like superfied versions of like 1940s, 1950s villains, but they all have like a weird psychological twist to them, Mm-hmm. But it's interesting seeing all of Spider-Man's villains, that a lot of them are also victims. A lot of them are victims of science, like he was.
And circumstance and where you fall.
And circumstance. Yeah, and circumstance of where you fall.
Otto is a victim of Norman.
Yeah.
And I love that comes out in the movie.
I think too that we talked about, can you undo your past mistakes? You can't, but you can try to do better the next time, right? And it's so beautiful. It's my favorite part of the movie, of course, when Andrew Garfield saves MJ, because he learned from his mistake, not to web her, but that he has to catch her. He wouldn't have known that if he hadn't made a terrible, terrible mistake, right? And, Tobey Maguire is also trying to make up for his mistakes and the things that they did wrong. Well, can we not look for like a Norman Osborn to say, I screwed up, I want to do better this next time? Maybe not. But one thing that this movie did performance-wise that I thought was really incredible was that they really allowed the actors to show you what they felt rather than tell you what they felt, right? So like, I'm thinking of that scene where Tobey Maguire stops Tom Holland from being able to kill the Green Goblin, and they stay on his face and you see in his eyes, it says everything you need to say. And it like, to tie in the mental health thing too, there's that great moment with all three Spider-Mans where he's like, hey, I don't know, I'm not liking this negative self-talk. You're amazing. Can you say that back to me?
So
like,
good.
I need to hear you say it. Like,
that was so good. I love that so much.
So that was a lot of ideas I sort of put into one paragraph. Sorry.
No, I think you're right. I think that I hadn't even somehow I hadn't I was just so overtouched by the like this time he saved her that I hadn't realized that you're right, that it's Garfield. He does something different. He doesn't, for those who don't remember that movie, it's that he webs her, but the nature of the web is that it stretches a little bit, and so like the web catches her, and she still keeps falling a few more feet, and thus hits, and that's how she dies. And this time he catches her instead. And yeah, I think that's another really beautiful part of the story, is this idea of that these fates aren't sealed, aren't fixed, and that we can change things, and we can learn, and we can grow.
From universe to universe, from this Spider-Man to that Spider-Man. In this one, it was Uncle Ben's words. In this universe, there was no Uncle Ben, so Aunt May, got to be that role in Peter's life. So even though each one of them is so similar, and there are all of these timelines, there are little differences, and there are things that can be changed, and there are, these little fourth dimensional consequences, both positive and negative.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about the one other big kind of set of ethical questions I was seeing in the movie, which is we've talked about how Peter winds up having these parental figures, like Aunt May, Uncle Ben, but then later Tony, Happy to an extent. Mysterio for a little bit, though Mysterio's a real bad babysitter, and now Doctor Strange. And granted, I'm not a parent, and Doctor Strange isn't officially a parent, but I'm curious, if you left your child with a babysitter, and the babysitter heard that your child was upset that people weren't getting into like the right schools, and so decided, okay, I'll help the child fundamentally rewrite reality. What's your take on the parental responsibility of Doctor Strange in a moment like that?
I love Doctor Strange. First, let me preface saying, he is probably if I could pick one character to be in the MCU, it would be Doctor Strange. However,
that is
he's
a
not
huge
great with
surprise
kids.
to me. That really surprises me, Nathan.
But he's not super great with kids.
And he's not super great with personal responsibility on the whole. I mean, he always gets where he needs to be in the end, but
And as a lot of people I think have pointed out, this is Doctor Strange at a very different point in his life than we saw him in the last movies. He's not the Sorcerer Supreme anymore. There's all this snow in the Mage building because he just hasn't been able to clean it up yet. And so it feels totally believable to me that he would try to fix this for Peter. Mm-hmm. Both because I think he does have that compassion for Peter, but also there's an ego there of it's the challenge. To me, I think one of the most telling moments is that as Peter keeps doing more and more to make the spell more and more unstable, Strange is mad at him. He's saying, stop, you got to stop. But he still is going to try and cast the spell because in his mind, he is still the person who thinks he can always do it. And that just we can talk about Spidey all the time because it's his movie, but I think Strange's choices could suffer some ethical examination, to be sure.
Yeah, when you're in many situations, when you are the smartest person in the room, and in some ways the most powerful person in the room, that can totally go to your head, especially when you're dealing with something like the entire universe, effectively, Doctor Strange is a magic version of Tony Stark. They have the same kind of hubris and arrogance. Yeah. They have a lot of power at the beginning.
The same facial hair,
which I support. But in many ways, you've got to continue to bring up their issue. It can't be something that has just been magically solved. They've improved a lot, but you have to continue to bring up their main dilemma, And so I think I've been curious because he goes through in the first Doctor Strange movie, he goes through such a transformation from beginning to end. I was really kind of curious on how they would bring back that arrogance, how they would bring back the hubris, especially after so much has gone right for him. I think now you can kind of see, maybe it wasn't, it worked out really well when we were fighting Thanos, changing time and peeking, using the time stone and peeking ahead to all these different realities and getting a cheat sheet. But it kind of didn't work with the whole Spider-Man thing, And so that's nice moving forward, I feel. just as a storyteller of seeing
Yeah.
how it. But yeah, I feel like he did definitely have the compassion of I don't think he cared too much about the school, but he was just seeing how much that Peter was going through, what all his friends were going through, and how he was basically persecuted at this point, that he was willing to now wield this fantastic power for his friends.
Well,
Yeah.
they make a joke of it, but he does say like, "Oh, come on, we've used it for less." Like, so you get this like little mischievous like, "I'm a scamp. I'm a
Yeah.
scamp who does magic." Like, do you remember this? Oh, well, I mean,
Well, and in some ways, it's one more corollary to the great power and great responsibility idea, because with great power comes the responsibility to use it when you should, but also the responsibility not to overuse it, not to abuse it, not to think that everything is a nail because you've got this glorious, wonderful, powerful hammer. And I think like if Doctor Strange says no, we don't have a movie, we probably have a better situation all around. Even if we don't ever get to discuss, why it was that Tobey Maguire didn't need the web shooters and all that kind of stuff.
yeah, that was fun. That was really fun.
What's your take on? We talked about the kind of meta-ness of all of this and how, it kind of is a nice thing for Garfield to get to have his moment and kind of an apology from, how fandom treated him. But obviously there were so many things in this movie that seemed about, I think some people call it fan service, and I hate that term. I think it was just, addressing some of the things that fans had questions about, but also doing it in ways that kind of, was giving fans a lot of what they wanted. And I think what we just talked about with the web shooters thing, with Tony, like giving an in-story explanation for that, having Daredevil come into the story in a way that, I remember walking out of Far From Home and saying to my spouse, it's a shame that they won't bring the Netflix MCU into the MCU proper the way they should, because if Spider-Man's having legal trouble in New York City, Matt Murdock should be his lawyer. And so seeing Matt Murdock, I was just like,
yes,
perfect. And what's your take on that? Like, does this become fan service, and is that a bad thing, or is this just like responsible storytelling in a way, or being able to balance all these things? What was your take on it?
I feel like it's fan service when it doesn't work. And in this, it's like when the first thing I thought of was like the Han Solo movie, like when things go out of their way to kind of add, oh, this is how Han Solo got his favorite boots, and it just feels like it takes a detour away from an organic story. And I feel like in this movie, bringing in Matt Murdock, if my mom didn't know who Matt Murdock was, she wouldn't have thought anything about that scene,
Right.
if she saw that. But yeah, it felt like, it kind of like very threaded this very careful needle of really making the most out of all these characters who are in each other's presence, and what would they do and how would they interact, and yet, kind of reference things that we've already seen. Now, I haven't seen all of I saw the first Andrew Garfield one, and then I skipped the second one because it just didn't. The first one didn't work for me. I was still at that point on team, Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire on those movies. But I was really affected by some of the stuff that Andrew Garfield did in this movie. Like, the dude frickin' stole the show in a lot of ways, you know? And I was still affected by stuff. And maybe there were additional references that I didn't get, but it still worked for me without maybe knowing the exact specific references. And I think that's the needle you've got to thread between fan service and genuinely, creating emotional moments with these characters that maybe have past references.
Yeah.
I missed the beginning of this, but I feel like Marvel does a great job of letting you do homework if you feel like doing homework, and not forcing you to do homework. Like if you didn't do the required reading, you can still have a great time at any of their movies. But if you want to like get down into the nuts and bolts, like you truly can. Like there's so many layers upon layers of Easter eggs and references that like, you know, you can gorge your little geek heart out. But if you don't feel like watching every single episode of every single Marvel TV show.
Yeah. I think that's such a good way to put it from both of you. And it's, Nathan, I'm glad you brought up the example of the Solo movie, because Star Wars, I think, is a franchise that has done both this very badly and quite well. You know, Solo, I think, is an example of where, like, they're throwing in things that if you don't know what it's referencing, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't feel like it fits the movie. Whereas, like, in the most recent TV show, The Bad Batch, there are so many times where you go to a planet that we've already gone to in one of the earlier Star Wars TV shows, and there's things that you see on it that show you how the story of that planet has continued or that character's continued. And it's a great reference, but if you haven't, like, you get just as much out of it because you're not, it feels, like you said, organic to the story. And I really like what you were talking about at Krissy there of, you know, it's where it makes sense. You know, it's where it's what the characters would do anyway. Like that homework idea. Like you can dig more if you want to, but even if this is just the first thing you're seeing, you can still enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be hard when it's like a fandom does its best to keep people out in a way, or like behind. Oh, you don't get this reference, so now you suddenly feel full of shame, as opposed to like, we just snuck this reference in, like it's for you if you want it, but they're not fan shaming anyone for not noticing that the magazine that's in the background is actually a reference to this secret thing that you only know about if you watched this animated series. It's like, oh my God.
I have to say, one of my proudest moments as a podcaster, in my Star Wars podcast, we were talking about The Mandalorian, and there's an episode where they see a skeleton of, you know, this big kind of desert monster creature, and I described it in those kind of terms, and I got an email from someone saying, anyone who's a true Star Wars fan would know that that's a Krat dragon. It's referenced in the role-playing game. It's referenced in the reference books. How can you do a Star Wars podcast if you don't know what that is? And I was just like, you know what? I am glad that there are podcasts that will help that person find what they want. That's not the podcast I want to do. The podcast I want to do is going to talk about the characters, going to talk about the issues. And sometimes we're going to be like, yeah, wasn't it amazing when Lizard Guy, like the Lizard Guy left in the van? I have no knowledge of what the name of Mr. Lizard was in the van. I'm just going to call him Mr. Lizard. Because I haven't done that part of my homework, and I'm fine with that, you know.
Luckily, his name is the Lizard, so you're not far off.
Okay. I like Mr. Lizard better, but I also understand that, you know,
maybe he prefers that, and everyone just calls him the Lizard, because it's hard to tell.
It did seem, I'm going back to that villains conversation, it did seem like his character got the littlest time in terms of why he's doing what he's doing, and maybe that was for the best, because even in the first Garfield movie, I didn't understand his motivations at all.
He didn't have an arm. He was missing an arm, and he had tried to solve his, you know, regenerate like a lizard, and then he was like, "Oh, now we should all be lizards." It was, you know.
You know, and I speaking as an amputee, I have my right leg amputated. Having it grow back would be fun. I'm not sure I've ever thought, therefore, let's all become reptiles.
Yeah, and then it would like immediately turn you evil. So
it's really a trade-off. It's a trade-off.
Yeah, you can make decisions. Well, friends, this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad I get to have you both on. Is there any other last things you wanted to bring up or points you wanted to make?
I would love it if this is a thing that catches on, and all of a sudden every universe is valid and they can all smash into each other at any time, and someday we'll get all the Batmans in a movie, and there will be too many Batmans.
Too many Batmans. Also, like, it would be because there's, you know, they talk about like the growth and maturity of a genre, you know, like of westerns and in superheroes. It would be great if there is some lasting effects or repercussions of a more humane hero villain dynamic like this. If this is kind of part of the curve of superhero movies maturing more, kind of like I felt like they were doing with like Logan, and other more superhero movies for adults.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and I think that's, in some ways, that's why and here we are, full spoilering on this and other MCU properties that have come up, as we are seeing more of the Netflix MCU characters coming into the Disney Plus and on-screen MCU. I think it's great, because one of the reasons I love the Netflix MCU so much is it felt like it went much deeper into that gray area. Captain America is good and the people he fights are bad. And Netflix, Luke Cage is good, but he's doing some, Jessica Jones is really cutting some ethical corners. Daredevil, what's he doing? In many ways, I think season 1 of Daredevil, you come very close to being sympathetic to Kingpin. In part because Vincent D'Onofrio's character is just so, his acting is so good. And yeah, you have to decide whether it's R or PG, and it would be hard for either Tom Holland or Christian Ritter to do this, but like Jessica Jones and Spider-Man talking about, how do they deal with these things, and the naivete versus the dark cynicism. Like, I'd love to see more of those conversations. So, well, great place to end it there. Thank you both so much for being a part of this. I mentioned your 80s podcast, but yeah, tell folks listening at home if they want to find that. What is that, and how can they find it?
Yes, it is the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast. It's at Most Excellent Pod. So, of course, you can search the name and find it in like all of the podcatchers and on Apple and iTunes and Stitcher and all of those things. And at Most Excellent Pod on all of the social medias.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely check that out. It's a great way to, whether you're someone like me who's a child of the 80s and loves nostalgia, or you have older folks in your life like me who like to prattle on about it while we wave our canes. It's a great podcast to listen to. Great content.
We do try to talk about the ethics too, like especially if like in the 80s movies where things are very gray.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to coming on that sometime and chatting with you about Risky Business. We were chatting about.
Oh yeah.
One that has if you're interested in questions of privilege and affluence and the things young men of privilege get to do, that's a fun movie to talk about.
Let's make a date. Let's do it.
Sure, I'm in. So yes, definitely check those out. Of course, you can check out all of my podcasts, all the media I'm doing at theethicalpanda.com. There you'll find this podcast, my Star Wars Universe podcast, which we will be starting coverage of the Book of Boba Fett. I have told my family already that we're doing lots and lots of Christmas stuff right up till the 27th, at which point I go back into being Book of Boba Fett's released 2 days after Christmas. We'll be here to cover it. So we're going to do coverage of that every episode. I've been doing coverage of Hawkeye on the MCU cast. Definitely check that out. Check out the Most Excellent 80s Movies podcast, and most importantly, let us know what you think. All the ways to give us feedback are on that website, theethicalpanda.com. Tweet at us, Facebook at us, send me an email. We'd love to know your thoughts. What did you think of the questions we discussed today? Let us know what you think, and most importantly, have a great day.